Hello and welcome to the FullStackDev tutorial series. In this video, we'll be configuring and setting up back-end tests. In the previous video, we utilized Redis, MySQL, a Python Flask backend, and a React front-end to create a simple example of a user sign-up, sign-in process. Everything is working as intended at this point. And this is a great time to introduce some tests to ensure we don't break our application moving forward in the development process. The first thing we'll want to do is create a pytest.ini file. Inside, we'll disable cache and define the entry point. Next, in the server directory, we'll designate a tests directory and create a tests.py file. We'll create a base test case that extends unit test, which will allow us to set up and tear down the Redis and MySQL test databases. And we'll create some functions to allow us to make requests with or without session credentials and/or user authentication. Inside the test folder, we'll create a fixtures directory to house a base fixtures file. The Studio Base Fixture class will allow us to initialize model fixtures and perform some basic database operations on the generated instances. And while we're here, let's initialize the tests directory. Now we'll put our testing tools to use. Back in the auth directory, let's designate a directory to house auth tests, and inside the tests directory we'll create a directory called auth fixtures that will contain an auth.py file. Extending from Studio Base Fixture, we'll need to override the generate function, which will allow us to create a user with the user model. In the auth tests directory, we'll create a file called models.test.py. And here we'll create a few test cases for the user model validate function and the user model API function. These tests are very simplified, but should tell us if our test suite configuration is working properly. Looking at Docker Compose YML, we can see the database name is FSD Studio Test DB, which is inconsistent with the database name in the config.py file. We'll need to change this in config.py in order for the requests to the test database be sent to the proper address. Now we can open a couple of terminal windows and make sure the virtual environment is activated. Using Docker Compose, we'll bring up the test version of the database and the Redis database. From the second terminal, we'll export the useTestAPI variable. This will activate the test config version of the Flask app. Then we can run our tests with the PyTest framework. And as we can see, PyTest collected all three functions from models.test.py, which all passed. We won't be focusing much more on unit testing, but we'll create another test for the auth endpoint to demonstrate the usefulness of the model fixtures and establish some basic utilization patterns. In auth tests, let's create auth endpoint test.py. We'll create a test case for the sign-in endpoint, and for test user 2, we want to set that email verified attribute to true. For this to work, we'll need to modify the test user fixture to allow for setting the attribute manually. So back in auth.py, let's add the additional parameters. Now when we run PyTest, we see that there are now 4 tests, and all 4 tests are passing. And we've demonstrated how to implement the test user fixtures to assert logic against the auth endpoint. This is as far as we'll go regarding writing unit tests for the back end. But there are some more features we want to add so that we can write end-to-end tests moving forward. In server button directory, we'll create a tasks directory and inside a sci tasks file along with and init.py. Here we'll create endpoints for database setup and teardown, and endpoints for coverage start and coverage stop. Now we're ready to register the routes in FactoryPy Easy Blueprints function, pending the environment is not production. We're almost finished setting up the backend for testing, but we do have an issue that we'll run into later if we don't address it now. Notice, in tests.py authenticate user function, we're using the sign-in endpoint with an outdated username, password, method of user authentication, which is not consistent with how we're actually implementing user sign-in. We're actually using a two-factor authentication method that requires access to the user's email account. So what we can do is modify this function to use the createSession function from the dev session, devutils, and remove the password field from the payload variable. This will directly add the needed cookies, along with the web tokens we need to authenticate the user session. This will be as far as we go here on the back-end test config for now. We've set up everything we need to write unit tests with PyTest for the Flask backend, and also added some endpoints for end-to-end tests, which we'll implement in a following video. And with that, we'll bring this video to an end. In the next video, we'll be setting up Cypress for front-end unit testing and furthering our test configuration for end-to-end tests. We're looking forward to seeing you there. As always, thank you for watching the FullStackDev tutorial video series. If you have found these videos helpful in any way, please like and subscribe to the channel. See you again soon.